Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Woman magazine, the set pages of which are an optional product that some schools choose to study for Eduqas component 2 at A-level. In this video, I'm going to focus on representation within the set pages of Woman magazine. So we'll start with the representation of women and we'll go through some of the pages just to give you a bit of an oversight. Now, obviously, if you look at the front cover, women are represented as being quite glamorous, with the emphasis being put on beauty. The cover model has got a full face of makeup, fashionable makeup and hair for the time period. There are articles mentioned such as A-level beauty, suggesting that being beautiful is something that is important for a woman and that she should be good at. Of course, beauty in magazines has always been about playing on women's insecurities and encouraging them to change their appearances. And the makeup pages, the A-level beauty double page spread, does exactly that. It talks to women about contouring their faces in order to change the shape of their face, to slim it, to lengthen it, to give it cheekbones. It talks about slimming a wide or broad nose. So there's very much this focus on changing the way you look in order to look what is socially considered more beautiful, more attractive. The Max Factor advert in here for the Cream Puff foundation, again, focuses very much on encouraging women to look good for men. So this idea that you should cover your skin and that you should do it in order to attract a man. Quite a traditional view of women and femininity. Alfred Hitchcock's double page article, or even triple page article really, he talks a lot about women and their appearances, very much focusing on things like their hair colour and whether they are more of an English rose in terms of their skin tone or whether they've got more kind of tanned, sun-kissed American skin tones. And so very much this focus on women's appearance being what's most important about them. He does talk a little bit about women losing their inhibitions in the home, and there's some connotations of that are definitely quite sexual. The implication being that women are quite wild in the confines of their own home. And even he says, I think I might be being a bit disrespectful, but I don't care. So there is this kind of representation of women becoming more sexualized, becoming more sexual beings in the eyes of the media and in the eyes of men. Within the article about Alfred Hitchcock, he mentions that all women should be really happy if they are bought a new hat or a new dress. There's this idea that aesthetic things, surface things, products, items make women happy, particularly those that make them look more attractive. There is some representation of women being modest. So, for example, there's the use of the white gloves on the Jackie Kennedy picture. White gloves were quite fashionable at the time, but it was about this idea of not showing too much flesh and keeping kind of modest with your hands. And that modesty is something that people were traditionally used to seeing women represented as all the way up until the sort of 1950s and 1960s. However, things were changing. Women were becoming more sexualized, both in the media and in society as a whole. There was a sexual revolution going on. So you can see some evidence of this in some ways in the magazine in which women are represented. So, for example, the front cover mentions about lingerie, so this idea of making them into more of a sexual being rather than just a domestic one. There's also an advert in there for Breeze soap where the picture of the woman, she's completely naked and just covered in foamy suds. Again, very sexualizing, very objectifying of her. And, you know, of course, that would appeal to women in that they would want to look like this woman, but it would also very much appeal to men as well. So even though this is a magazine aimed at women, we're still very much seeing women through the male gaze in this magazine, seeing them sexualized and objectified. Women definitely seen as objects in several parts of the pages. Alfred Hitchcock actually describes a woman as an appendage at some point, which is very much just dehumanizing her and seeing her as an item or something to be attached to you rather than an actual individual human. In the home improvement article, there is the suggestion that a kind of kitchen, it would be too difficult for a woman to put together and she would need a big strong man to put it together for her. It says a man in their life, you would need to assemble the kitchen. So this is kind of representation of women being powerless, helpless and needing to be looked after and protected by men. And therefore the kind of representation of men as being strong, muscular, capable and practical. The idea that being married is the ultimate goal for a woman is found in several pages. There's lots of talks about getting married and getting engaged, finding the right man, going on dates. So a very heteronormative view of the world. Alfred Hitchcock even talks about an actress called Madeleine Carroll and says that, she was married 2 or 3 times, as though this is kind of the ultimate goal, to be able to attract and keep a man multiple times, even if your husband's pass away or you get divorced. He seems to be praising her for the ability to find a man and get him into a marriage. There's still a focus in this magazine on domesticity, women being at home and taking care of domestic chores. So there's items in the contents page about cookery, about childcare, about the home and improving your home, and in particular improving your kitchen, which is where women were expected to spend a lot of their time. There's a page full of adverts. One of the adverts is for Mother magazine, suggesting that a lot of women of this age group would be expected to be parents, which reflects the time period. And as part of that advert for Mother magazine, there's a free cookery guide being given out, so that if it wasn't clear enough, this advert makes it clear that your role as a woman is to take care of your children and to cook for your family. In the Evelyn Home article, there's some advice being sought by readers, and one lady writes in about the idea that her husband is cheating on her, and the agony aunt that replies very much suggests that the woman is to blame in the marriage for her husband cheating. The fact that she may have been slightly cold towards him has kind of forced him to cheat in the eyes of this agony aunt. And perhaps this representation of women being to blame for a marital breakdown it is quite reflective of that 1960s time period, that it was a woman's job to keep her husband happy. The woman on the front cover is smiling, suggesting she's very happy with this life. There's lots of smiling women within the magazine pages, suggesting that this domestic life of being beautiful, keeping the home, and generally making your husband happy is something that women should aspire to and that women should be pleased by. And this very much reflects the time period in which the magazine was made. In the 1960s, there was still this emphasis by the government, by mainstream media, on trying to encourage women to go back into the home, to stay in the home, and to see being in the home as something that they should be entirely happy with. There are some reflections that women and their roles and responsibilities were changing at the time. So there is an image of a lady standing with her foot on a man's head as he lies on the floor. So certainly giving this idea of a woman being slightly more powerful than perhaps she might have been in the previous few decades. There are also several articles and advice pages and questions about women who were starting work for the first time, what to do when you first start work, how to deal or talk to your boss. And starting work, don't forget, was quite a new thing for women in the 1960s. The idea that women wouldn't just stay in the home and be housewives and mothers was quite new. So certainly reflecting some of the new changes that were going on for women in the 1960s. There are some suggestions that women could be quite powerful if they wanted to. There is an advert suggesting women could join the WRAC and become a kind of army cadet. Now, they obviously would not be fighting on the front lines at that time. They would be going more in a support capacity, but perhaps offering women a sense of control and a sense of power and responsibility and independence, which some women in the 1960s would have really, really wanted. If we have a look at the representation of men, on the other hand, they are represented in a reasonably stereotypical way: powerful, dominant, important, and successful. Alfred Hitchcock gets several pages of the magazine dedicated to him, with a lot of photos of him, multiple photos, suggesting a power and importance. The article mentions several films that he's made, awards that he's won, successes that he's had. So very much representing him as being somebody who is at the top of his field. You'll notice that in the article about him, there's no emphasis on his appearance, his beauty, his fashion, or his role in the home. The focus is very much on his ability to lead and direct on a film shoot. He uses words that represent him as being very powerful. So, for example, he uses phrases such as I decided, I cast her, I introduced her, I wouldn't allow her to. So very much using phrases that suggest that he's very powerful and that he can control the women that he works with. He does actually acknowledge the patriarchal nature of Britain at the time. He talks about how men are often seen as the most dominant people in British households. And actually, I suppose it's a reflection of the 1960s and the rise of feminism that he even acknowledges this, because a lot of men would perhaps just see this as normal and wouldn't necessarily even recognise it. But he still definitely seems to think that this is the preferred way of doing things. He doesn't suggest this should change. There are some images, like I said, of the man lying on the floor, suggesting a little bit of lack of power. And again, perhaps reflecting the changing roles of men at the time, the way men sometimes felt a little bit less important just because women were getting some more equality. On the page about men, the article points out some physical, biological differences between men and women, kind of emphasising almost like binary opposites between the genders. So things like lung capacity, it's pointing out that women would be more out of breath from a brisk walk or a run, whereas perhaps men wouldn't. Pointing out these biological differences, you know, again, quite normal attitudes of the time, this idea that men and women they thought were inherently different. And certainly having a whole page about men and one of the subheadings being getting to know them kind of suggests that women really didn't know very much about men at the time. This idea that they were binary opposites. Women didn't really have a lot of knowledge of the opposite sex and that they needed to find out about them, almost as if they're kind of aliens. They needed to learn about, the language of men and their opinions and what they think. However, the article does suggest that you can't measure intelligence differences between men and women. So there might be a suggestion there that men and women might have the same intelligence levels, or that women might even perhaps be more intelligent. And perhaps that suggestion reflects some of the changing attitudes towards women at the time. One of the fiction pages, one of the characters within one of the stories refers to a woman as a cheap, dirty slut. Nice. So, the wording, the way the men are talking about women, very much kind of seen them in sexualized ways, in degrading and being quite disrespectful towards them with their tone and their language. And again, perhaps reflecting the way men thought of women, this idea that men felt women should be pure, virginal, sweet, innocent, and so perhaps reflecting that idea within the story. There's still very much a representation that sex before marriage should probably be avoided, even though the sexual revolution was going on at the time. In lots of the advice questions and articles, the letters that have been written in, there are some questions about sex before marriage and relationships. And certainly a lot of the advice given suggests that couples should wait until they get married before having sex. Again, very representative of the way relationships were being dealt with at the time, and showing maybe perhaps quite a conservative view towards sex and relationships. As like I said, the sexual revolution was going on at the time. A lot of people were becoming a lot more relaxed and liberal about their views on things like this. But because Woman was a mainstream magazine aimed at quite traditional audiences, it makes sense that their representations of marriage and the values of sex and virginity would still be quite conservative. It's useful to have a look at the representation of ethnicity within the pages as well. Obviously, every single image of people within the magazine are white women or white men, very reflective of the fact that, this was an ethnocentric mainstream magazine in the 60s, and they tended to avoid models from ethnic backgrounds. Certainly the makeup pages reflect a focus on white ethnicity. There are no darker models, and the types of makeup used as well, the suggestions of shades to be used are much lighter. There's a focus on getting like English rose complexions and sun-kissed complexions, but certainly nothing that suggests that any of their readers might be from more ethnic minority backgrounds. And this obviously follows the fact that ethnic minority people, models, audiences have often been underrepresented and marginalised within the magazine industry, in particular within fashion and beauty magazines. Within the fiction story called Island of Secrets, there's very much this post-colonial representation where two white characters are exploring a kind of tropical or jungle island, which is seen to be exotic and foreign and strange, which very much is the kind of representation of ethnicity that you will often see, in Gilroy's theories when he talks about how people from ethnic minorities are often represented. You can see that they talk about a Chinese character within this, and they talk about him being secretive, blackmailing, and they call him the Chinese. So quite a disparaging way of talking about somebody, but very reflective of people's attitudes towards, in particular, Asian people within the 1960s. Had the Vietnam War going on at the time, and there'd been a lot of propaganda against Asian people and Asian countries. So perhaps the representations of a Chinese person within a kind of villainous role makes sense in comparison when you think of that context, the historical context of what was going on in the world at the time. Might also be useful to have a little think about the representation of age as well. Quite a lot of young, beautiful women who look as though they were in their kind of late teens to perhaps 30s. Very little for older women within these pages. And actually, if you have a look at the WRAC advert where they're encouraging people to join up, they actually talk about a poor lady called Brenda who thinks she's unemployable because she's 25. Poor Brenda. So this idea that age was seen as a very limiting factor in the 1960s. If you weren't married and had a husband and children by the time you were 25, you wouldn't be able to find a job because a lot of organisations, companies, employers would assume that you were going to get married and have children ASAP, or this assumption that you were washed up and that you did not have anything to give back to society at that age. So that was my easy to understand guide to representation within the set pages of Woman magazine. Don't forget to hit subscribe for other videos. I'm uploading a lot more about Woman magazine in the next couple of weeks, and a lot more relevant to Eduqas and the other exam boards too. And if you've got any questions, don't forget you can always leave a comment below, and then I will try and answer you as soon as I can.